Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our virtual public lecture of the OSCE Academy. My name is Aygul Abdubayatova. I'm head of the Research and Training Unit at the OSCE Academy. And let me introduce today's speaker, Ana-Maria Anghelescu. Ana-Maria is our Associate Research Fellow at the OSCE Academy, and she is also an exchange student in the Politics and Security program of the OSCE Academy. And she's also a Ph.D. candidate at National University of Political Studies and Public Administration in Romania. Ana-Maria is researching the cooperation between Central Asian countries and Romania in the context of the European Union strategy towards Central Asia. So this is the strategy, the new EU strategy that she will be talking about today. So welcome, Ana-Maria, to the screen as well. I just want to explain a few rules before Ana-Maria starts her lecture. The lecture will start 40 minutes, and after that we will have a Q&A session. But we will do the Q&A session in written form. I mean, you can send your questions in written form to Zoom chat, and also if Vika can set up Facebook, then you can also ask questions on Facebook under comments. But everyone will be muted, but you are welcome to send your questions anytime during Anna's lecture and after the lecture. We will be collecting all the questions, and after in the Q&A session, Ana-Maria will be answering them one by one. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the lecture. And now I give the floor or screen to Ana-Maria.
Thank you, Aygul. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and welcome to my lecture. I have to admit it's the first time I'm having an online lecture, and also the first real lecture on my research topic. As Aygul mentioned, I'm doing my PhD researching Romania's foreign policy towards Central Asia, possible options for a stronger cooperation. And as part of this research, I've been analyzing also the foreign policy of the European Union towards Central Asia. So, as you all know, in June 2019, the European Union presented a new strategy right here in Bishkek. So we will see today how the European Union came to this, and in the end of the presentation, maybe make some recommendation. I have to mention that this lecture is based on a policy brief that I wrote for the OSCE Academy's Central Asian Policy Brief series. You can find it online on the website, and the ideas are better explained and more detailed. So I will share now my screen, and I hope you will see the presentation. So let me. The title of this presentation is Towards the Implementation of the 2019 European Union Strategy for Central Asia. And in this presentation, I want to touch upon the following points. The first one, I will make a brief overview of the EU external relations. Then I will go into the stages of the EU cooperation with Central Asia, starting from 1991 until present days. I will try to make a comparison of the 2007 strategy with the 2019 to see what has changed, what has remained the same. At the same time, I will introduce new research that I'm pursuing now, the Central Asian perceptions of the European Union. It's at an early stage, so bear with me here, it's still to be improved. And in the end, as I said, I will make some recommendations based on my analysis. So why am I talking about EU external action and I'm not talking specifically about EU foreign policy? It's because the EU in itself is a very complicated structure, and its foreign policy is not just foreign policy. So it's rather external action. As you can see on the left side, we have the main areas where the European Union is dealing with the foreign partners. We have trade policy, which is dealt by the European Commission in the DG Trade. We have development aid, also by the Commission in DG DevCo. We have enlargement policy, which is dealing with the candidate countries, so the countries that want to join the European Union, and the neighborhood policy addressing precisely the neighbors of the European Union, such as the Eastern Partnership countries and the countries from North Africa and Middle East. It's dealt by DG NEAR and also by the European External Action Service. And we have the common foreign and security policy and the common defense and security policy. Both of them are dealt with by the European External Action Service. So as you can see, we have a mix of policies and a mix of ideas, which we will see creates some problems for the coherence of the EU external action. How did we get here? As you all know, the European Union started mostly as an economic union in the wake of World War II. So the first policy that was implemented was, of course, a commercial policy, a common commercial policy dealing with international trade agreements. Fast forward to 1970s, and many changes in the cooperation between the member states of the European communities, we have the first European political cooperation. It meant an informal consultation between the member states of the European Union on foreign policy. It's very important to note that it was just an informal consultation. It was not legally binding, and it didn't mean adoption of common views. But again, fast forward to 1993, when the Maastricht Treaty of the European Union came into force, we have a redesign of the entire European Union. As I said before, we were talking about the European communities. Now we are talking about the European Union in itself, which was based on 3 pillars. One of them is supranational, the communities, and 2 of them were intergovernmental. One of these intergovernmental pillars was the common foreign and security policy, which meant that the member states had to consult more and had to come up with more common ideas for the foreign policy of the European Union as an actor in itself, not as an international organization or as a cooperation of member states. Also worth mentioning is that with Amsterdam Treaty in 1997, the European Union created the position of High Representative for Common and for Foreign and Security Policy. It didn't have the role it has today. It was more about communication. It was more about bringing really together at the same table the European Union, somehow making it have the same voice, but not really managing it. In 2009, with the entry into force of the latest treaty of the European Union, the Treaty of Lisbon, we see a consolidation of the European Union foreign policy. We have more coordination, we have a clear voice in the person of the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. We have an European External Action Service, which is kind of like a Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the European Union. So we notice an increase in a unitary voice of the European Union. On the right side, you can see the complicated structure of the foreign policy institutions of the European Union. What you see here is that the High Representative is, let's say, at the center of it, and it bridges many institutions and many roles. The High Representative is also Vice President of the European Commission. The High Representative is also chairing the Foreign Affairs Council in the Council of the EU. For those that are not familiar with the EU structure, the Council of the European Union is an institution that brings together representatives of ministries dealing with specific topics at the level of the European Union. So in the Foreign Affairs Council, we have the ministries of foreign affairs coming together and discussing issues of common interest. And the High Representative is chairing this council. And last but not least, the European Council, which is, excuse me, for those that are joining later, please mute your microphone so that we won't have any issues? Thank you. So as I was saying, the European Council is an institution made up of heads of governments and of states of the European Union. And when they are coming together and they are meeting, the High Representative is also joining, ensuring the coherence of the EU external action. The High Representative heads the European External Action Service, which in turn leads and makes the European Union presence in in other states through delegation, liaison offices, and we have also special representatives. The special representatives are not exactly ambassadors of the European Union, but they are dealing with specific regions. And in Central Asia, we have His Excellency Ambassador Peter Burian dealing with the cooperation between the EU and Central Asia. In the center, you see the EU Common Foreign and Security Policy goals. Mostly, it's a normative agenda. Even though we have the international security aspect there, it's still dealing with it in the context of a normative agenda, promotion of values, peace, international cooperation, democracy, rule of law, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. Because we have a different policy, the Common Defense and Security Policy, that's dealing with more hard security issues, with more military issues. So having in mind this structure, complicated structure of the EU external action and EU foreign policy, we can now move on to the stages of the EU involvement in Central Asia. And I divided them not very creatively, let's say, but based on the documents provided by the EU. But still, these documents adopted by the European Union, mainly the strategies, offer this separation in stages based on some well-defined criteria. The first criteria was criterion was the geographical location, whether the European Union was closer or further from Central Asia. Also, we have the power dynamics in international system and also in Europe and Central Asia, and the European interests. So, considering all this, I consider we have three stages. The first stage is the stage of getting to know Central Asia. The European Union didn't know Central Asia very well, so at first it had to get to know it from 1991, so from the independence of Central Asian states, to 2007, when the first strategy for Central Asia was adopted. From the adoption of the new strategy, we talk about the second stage, is a more engaged and more coordinated, let's say, stage where the European Union has already a normative and security agenda that it's trying to balance here in the region. This stage is ending either where, if you're talking about the adoption of the European Union Global Strategy in 2016, which led to the adoption of the new strategy for Central Asia in 2019, or precisely with the adoption of the 2019 strategy. Nevertheless, we have between 2016 and 2019 a reshuffling of the approach towards Central Asia. So we have learning from the past and trying to improve the partnership between EU and Central Asia. The first stage, in 1991, you can see on the right side of the slide a map, and you can see the red line is drawing the eastern border of the European Union at the time, and we have in the blue circle roughly Central Asia. So you can see that European Union was quite far from Central Asia. It wasn't direct neighbor, and it meant that they didn't really have direct connections, although they had interests based on the economic potential and energy resources that region had. But at the same time, the European Union was dealing with its own security problems. First, we had the transition from communism to market economy and democracy in Central and Eastern European states, which were precisely at the border of the European Union. And at the same time, we were dealing with the violent breakdown of former Yugoslavia, which led to the Balkan Wars. So the European Union was dealing mostly in the immediate neighborhood. And at the same time, the budgetary restraints and the limited resources generally that the European Union had in order to deal with the neighbors and with the external action made Central Asia less of a priority. The level of cooperation wasn't that high, but still we had trade agreements and the partnership and cooperation agreements, which offer technical assistance and development aid. Here you can see an evolution of this EU agreement with Central Asian states. Most of them were negotiated during the 90s and entered into force at the end of the 90s. The notable exception is Tajikistan, which had a war in the 90s, so the negotiations started in early 2000s and ended with the ratification and the entry into force of the PCA in 2010. As well as Turkmenistan, which signed the partnership in 1998. You can see it's quite early, but the agreement was not yet ratified because of the human rights violations. At the same time, we see the next stage in PCAs. It has partnership and cooperation agreements. Kazakhstan is leading here. The agreement was signed in 2015 and came into force last month on 1st of March. Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan started negotiations on these enhanced partnerships, and Tajikistan also expressed interest in joining this framework of cooperation, but the negotiations didn't start yet. Moving on to the second stage of the cooperation of EU and Central Asia, we see how the agenda of some states is moving on to the European level. And why am I saying this? Starting from the independence of Central Asia, we have the most active member state in the region was Germany. For various interests, economic, people-to-people contact, political reasons. So why in 2007 we have a new strategy, the first strategy actually for Central Asia? It's because first we had the latest rounds of enlargement in the European Union, so 2004 and 2007, and the European Union reached the shores of Black Sea. In this way, the European Union came a bit closer to Central Asia. Also, in 2007, in the first half of the year, Germany was was having the presidency of the Council of the European Union. And at that time, based on the structure of the European Union, the Council and the member states were having more to say even about the strategic framework of the foreign policy of the European Union. During those 6 months in office, Germany had this idea for a new Ostpolitik, as they say in German, and they promoted the adoption of a Black Sea synergy and also the strategy for a new partnership with Central Asia. However, this strategy was based mostly on a conditionality mindset. Although the European Union had specific interests in the region, mainly energy security, considering the problems that it had with having only Russia as the main supplier of energy resources, but without offering any clear incentive. As I mentioned before, Central Asian states had cooperation agreements already with the European Union. They had trade agreements and they received development aid. So the conditionality, you do something, I offer you something else, wasn't really working because the European Union didn't have anything to offer. There was no possibility of integration for Central Asia in European Union. So the first part of the implementation of the strategy witnessed a momentum of increased cooperation. It meant more political dialogue between the two regions, more meetings, more cooperation, more opening of new delegation, upgrading the delegation status in all Central Asian states. But it witnessed also a fatigue by the end of the time. And in 2012, we have a review determined mostly by the announcement by the United States for the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also because of these struggles by the European Union to deal with Central Asia. And in 2012, we witnessed that the European Union is focusing more on the security agenda without withdrawing from the normative agenda. We have high-level security dialogue, bringing together foreign ministers of the Central Asian states with the European Union to discuss issues of common interest, and the European Union promoting more engagement between Central Asia and Afghanistan. At the same time, counterterrorism was added specifically to this strategy, and let's not forget that energy security was also important, so the Trans-Caspian pipeline system was also included in this review of the strategy. Next, the strategy of the European Union witnessed a new review in 2015, which was determined by, let's say, internal factors, European internal factors. In 2014, we had a new European Commission and a new High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy in the person of Federica Mogherini. She was more determined to make the European Union foreign policy more coordinated and more active at the global level. That is why her team started preparing the global strategy, which was launched in 2016. In view of this preparation, we have the 2015 review of the Central Asian strategy, which appealed for more coordination, more flexibility, and differentiation among the states, because the original strategy was focusing broadly on the region. No differentiation between the member states, because European Union viewed Central Asia as a unitary region with common challenges, and the domestic policies were roughly kind of the same. In this period, in the second stage of EU cooperation with Central Asia, as I mentioned, we witnessed an increase in cooperation, political cooperation. But we see also a launching of trade and investment agreements, actually a relaunching of these trade and investment agreements. Central Asia as a region has the EU as its main trade partner, as we can see in the first graph. But the problem is that if we take each country by itself, EU is not leading unless we're talking about Kazakhstan, which has a big economy. And also, if we're talking about foreign direct investment, also in Kazakhstan, the EU is leading with 57%. But as this, the data is provided in a briefing by the European Parliamentary Research Service for the members of the European Parliament in January 2019, so in view of the adoption of the new strategy, this briefing mentions that in real terms, the EU trade with Central Asia is stagnating. So actually, we're not talking about a real success of the European Union's strategy of 2007 in bringing the EU closer in terms of economic and foreign trade relations. At the same time, if we're looking at the development aid that the European Union is providing to Central Asia, we can see that the EU is one of the main donors here in Central Asia. At the same time, if we're comparing the development aid the EU is providing to different regions, if we're talking in absolute terms, the amount is insignificant compared to the other regions, as you can see in the second slide, in the second graph. But if we're talking in terms of per capita development aid, euros per person, we can see, of course, that the neighborhood is leading. And then the second region that receives, broadly speaking, region that receives the most per capita development aid from the European Union is the African and Caribbean and Pacific group of states. So the former colonies, which still have a very strong relation with the former metropoles in the European Union. Central Asia comes third, but of course it's still a good improvement, considering that the money that the European Union is allocating to Central Asia has continuously increased since 2007. If we're talking about the thematic cooperation of the development aid, the EU is focused on sustainable development, education, and rural development. Now, talking about the third stage of the of cooperation, as I mentioned, in 2016 we have a new EU global strategy, shared values, common views. We have this keyword of resilience, which means creating societies that are able to resist to any possible threats, and the European Union is trying to build its global role, its role as a global actor, as a promoter of this resilience in other societies. Also, in 2017, the EU adopted a new development consensus. It's a review of how the European Union is providing foreign development aid to other countries, and it calls for more coordination. And because of the adoption of the global strategy in 2016, the entire foreign relations of the European Union went through a reshuffling through the adoption of the specific regional strategies. And in 2019, in May, we are talking about a new strategy for Asia, which had as a keyword connectivity. In June 2019, the European Union launched here in Bishkek the new strategy for Central Asia, new opportunities for a stronger partnership. It still maintained the regional cooperation focus, but it had three priorities, three keywords actually: resilience, prosperity, and political dialogue. But political dialogue didn't mean only political dialogue with the national authorities, but also with the civil society organizations. We will talk more when I'm coming back to the comparison between the two strategies. But in order to do this, I will rely again on the brief by the European Parliamentary Research Service. So kind of self-evaluation of this implementation of the strategy. And we can see with green dots is good progress, with yellow dots mixed results, and with red dots we have little progress. So if we're looking roughly realistic and very pragmatic, we have very little good progress. And if we're looking exactly at the topics, we have formal progress actually, because we have regional dialogue at foreign ministers level. So we have meetings, we have opening of EU delegation in each Central Asian country. The most recent one was the upgrade of the liaison office in Turkmenistan to a fully fledged delegation, and in September we had an ambassador. And the establishment of human rights dialogue. So everything is formal, everything is about meetings, and everything is about having something in presence on the ground. But if we're looking at the mixed results, we see that we do not really have real progress. So we do not have a general improvement of the human rights situation, although we have those human rights dialogues. We do not have even results. So some countries are more advanced in terms of any kind of cooperation with the European Union, and some countries are less advanced. Some are working better on some topics, and some are working less on these topics. So we have very uneven cooperation, and this is mostly a result of this idea that the European Union had of bringing Central Asia as a region together, which is not bad. But at the same time, the European Union had to take into account the fact that Central Asia is formed out of 5 states, each one with their own problems and their own challenges, political challenges. So comparing the strategies, in 2007, as I mentioned, the strategy was having a conditionality mindset. The European Union came here to teach their model of integration and cooperation and of development. Plus, it was based on this idea of the European Union being the only one that has interest in Central Asia, and having this idea of it was subtly patronizing. And in this sense, I strongly recommend the research done by Olga Linda Spicer about the EU influence in Central Asia. She analyzes, based on years of research, on the ground research, how the European Union was perceived as a teacher, as a mentor, and as this role model for Central Asia. But in 2019, if we're reading carefully the strategy, we notice an improvement. We see that the European Union is not looking at Central Asia from a superior perspective, but more like an equal partner. And the partnership is also enhanced. So we have differentiation. Although we maintain the general approach, the general regional approach, we are looking to the local challenges. And also, how is this done? Through a very long consulting process. In 2007, we recall the strategy was drafted mostly in Brussels and probably mostly by Germany, led by Germany as president of the Council of the EU. But for the 2019 strategy, we had a year-long consultation process with all stakeholders from Central Asia, national level and local level, as well as in the European Union member states. And the partnership is enhanced through new instruments, such as the enhanced partnership and cooperation agreements. The previous strategy was very broad. Everybody agreed that it was kind of a Christmas tree. That was the key word every researcher and analyst mentioned when referring to this strategy. It included everything. It had 7 priorities and 40 general goals of cooperation, which is a lot. But in 2019, we have a more focused approach. We have 3 main priorities, as discussed, but we have only 10 specific objectives. And for 10 specific objectives, we have 40 deliverables. Of course, the critics will say that the ideas are the same, that there's still this broad approach where we include everything. But at the same time, by narrowing down and making everything more clear and more specific, the European Union managed to create the premises for a stronger cooperation and more coordination. The problem in 2007 was that the European Union saw Central Asia as a mirror region. Even though it wasn't specifically mentioned in the strategy, the European Union dreamed somehow of Central Asia as integrating as Europe did after the World War II. But that was not a realistic approach. And even how the European Union approached Central Asia in having both normative agenda and security interests, human rights versus energy security and military security, showed that this regional approach wasn't really feasible. But at the same time, in 2019, the European Union doesn't drop the normative agenda because the European Union acknowledges that is the only actor involved in Central Asia that has this normative agenda and still pursues it. And I would argue that in this geopolitical region, the fact that the European Union is maintaining its normative agenda as a civilian power, as it is branded, is its unique selling point. So that is why the European Union is still attractive to the Central Asian states. Whether they want or not to reform, that's still something that attracts them. That the European Union is not having hidden reasons for which it cooperates with Central Asia. In 2007, the European Union had another problem. Because of this subtly patronizing character of the strategy, it favored a top-down approach. And a big part of the funds that the EU allocated to Central Asia were translated into budgetary assistance and money for governments to pursue their policies, reforming or not. But in the new strategy, we can see that the European Union is trying to open up more to people-to-people contacts and more to the civil society, more to sharing of best practices, with stress on sharing best practices, not just transferring best practices from the European Union to Central Asia. So the European Union strategy from 2019 has the potential of making it right towards Central Asia and really making the European Union a global actor and a really visible actor in the region. Why is it so? Because the European Union has to deal with the Central Asian perceptions of the EU. And by structuring a new strategy, by involving in the consultation process the Central Asian states, the European Union opened a more comprehensive dialogue with these countries. What you see here is an early on research of mine of how the Central Asian states perceive the European Union, and is based mostly on official documents and official discourses, foreign policy concepts where they are publicly available, or discourses by the national political elites. And the common denominator of all the five states' perception, even there are like various degrees to which they see European Union as such, is that there is a hierarchy of how the European Union is perceived in Central Asia. Firstly, the European Union is an economic partner, then is a development aid provider, and only the last one is as a normative agenda setter. So most of the Central Asian states would like to drop this normative agenda and focus more on economic partnerships, while the European Union would like to upgrade the normative agenda and enhance the political dialogue. We'll see what happens next with the new strategy. But in order for the European Union to increase this political dialogue, I have identified 4 needs, which are in line with the needs and the recommendations identified by many other researchers. So we have a need for coherence, both externally and internally. Externally, we have the need for coherent action with other donors. So where there are common actions, the European Union has to work with other donors to avoid overlapping activities. And also the European Union has to be more coherent internally. We saw the complicated structure of the EU external action, and we also know that the foreign policy is still national competence even in the European Union. So in order for the EU to have a strong engagement, it needs to be coherent with other actors so it doesn't double the efforts while still maintaining its own agenda. And also it has to bring more the member states at the table with Central Asia. That's the need for engagement and unity. For now, we still have leading states. It's in France, from the Western Europeans. Italy is quite active in the economic sphere. And we have some disparate efforts from the Eastern European states, but they are not as strong as the other ones. So what the European Union should do, should offer more possibility for member states that are smaller and do not have the resources to engage bilaterally with Central Asia, but still have interests and potential areas of cooperation, to give them a seat at the table. So it has to define specific channels of leveraging Central Asia into having these reforms done and pursuing this normative agenda by bringing together states that have the same legacy, the same history, the same struggled with the same challenges. That's the general political level. If we're moving on to the level of EU as a donor, which plays very well on the soft power of the European Union and very well on its public diplomacy, the European Union has to engage more with the civil society. If we look at the data, yes, the European Union is one of the leading donors, but the society doesn't know that, because the European Union is implementing most of its projects with international NGOs, with international consultancy companies, or with many other donors. So the European Union message and the European values are diluted in this process. So what we need first is a development agency which has offices here, because most of the reporting is done through the delegations. The delegations have their own political role, but doing reporting is a lot of work. So it's very difficult, and sometimes those projects and their results remain just numbers on papers. So the European Union has to establish, as Germany has its GIZ office, European Union should have a separate office in each Central Asian state, dealing only with funding and reporting of this project. Also, the European Union should focus more on building local capacity. As I said, most of the projects are implemented by third parties, which is not helping the civil society of Central Asia. So the European Union can set a threshold for the participation of civil society organizations from Central Asia, a higher threshold. So they will have more incentive to participate, and they would be they will have a stronger capacity. They will build this capacity to deal with the European funding. At the same time, the European Union should respond more to the local needs, and should address the civil society in local languages, not in Russian, not in English. But as I said, I am quite optimistic about the new strategy because it offers many opportunities. We have to see the instruments through which the European Union is going to implement this strategy, the money that they will allocate in view of the new multi-annual financial framework. For now, these are the main ideas that I think the European Union should keep in mind while thinking about the further engagement with Central Asia. Thank you very much for listening to me, and now we will go to the questions. Unfortunately, I see that there are no written questions in the chat, or I did not receive them. So if you have any questions, you can use the function of raise hand, and you can tell me your question, and I will try to answer to it. Thank you very much. So if someone has a question. Thank you, Nele, for the question. The question is if I can say some words about China's involvement in Central Asia in the context of the new EU strategy. Yes, the new strategy and actually the reshuffling of the European Union foreign policy generally, so the adoption of the global strategy was determined by the movements, let's say, at the international level. The annexation of Crimea by Russia, the Belt and Road Initiative by China. So we have in the 2019 strategy, there is no specific mention of China, but the European Union is trying to overcome this influx of economic cooperation and economic and infrastructure projects of China by focusing more on the normative agenda and maintaining its presence. Unfortunately, I am not an expert on China, so I cannot really give you an answer to that, but I can tell you that the European Union, of course, is dealing with China and officially on a partnership level, but unofficially we are talking about the European Union trying to preserve this Western democratic values here in Central Asia through its normative agenda. We have a question from Alejandro. Thank you. How to integrate civil society organizations due to the diversity of political situation in Central Asian countries? This is a very good question, and I would say, as I mentioned, yes, there are political differences in Central Asia, and yes, when the European Union is dealing with the civil societies, it still has to go through the filter, let's say, of the political regimes of each Central Asian countries. But at the same time, the European Union has to deal separately with each Central Asian countries according to their own needs. So the involvement and the participation of the civil society organization shouldn't be done in a regional approach, because of course each country has its own challenges, and we can see now that some are more open, some are less open. We can see even with this coronavirus crisis how the civil societies are dealing differently with it, and how the Central Asian states are dealing with their own civil societies. So I'm not advocating for European Union having one view of the civil society. It has to maintain differentiating between Central Asian states, because we talk about the region here, but there are still national states with their own national needs, as we are in the European Union also. Adrian Preda also has a question: how does Russia interfere with the new EU strategy? Has Russia an alternative strategy? Well, the Russian presence in Central Asia is not defined by specific institutionalized strategy, except for the foreign policy concepts, where the Central Asia, of course, is mentioned. Central Asia is high on the agenda of Russia in terms of maintaining its regional presence. As we know, Russia doesn't want to lose its grip here, and that is why we have this political tango, let's say, with China as well, because too many political challenges to the way Russians and Chinese see the evolution of Central Asia. Rajab Tayeb also has a question. You mentioned that, excuse me. You mentioned that EU somehow wanted to launch a regional integration project, something similar to EU in the Central Asia, but later they found that it was not really possible. What factors prevent launching such a regional project in this region? First of all, it's the European Union didn't have the necessary means to promote this regional integration, because the Central Asian states are not willing to cooperate in themselves. Why? Because they still have their own bilateral challenges, and we are talking here about regimes that do not trust each other, and they are highly personalistic, and they depend mostly on the ideas of their leaders. So if the leaders do not want to cooperate, they do not cooperate. What we witness these days is a change in that. Starting with the transition in 2016 in Uzbekistan, which was also mentioned as a positive factor in the 2019 strategy of the European Union, we see little steps in a regional integration, but regional integration is still a very strong word for what is happening in Central Asia. We have mostly regional consultations, and Uzbekistan is leading here. This trend, even now in the coronavirus crisis, we saw that Shavkat Mirziyoyev talked with the other Central Asian leaders about how to deal with this crisis, offered aid to the neighbors. So the regional cooperation mostly depends on the parties that are, the countries that are parts of it. So that is the main reason why we did not have regional integration. At the same time, we had some projects led by Russia or China of integrating Central Asia in other regional organizations, but not Central Asia in itself. We remember there was Central Asia Cooperation Organization, which was which failed because there was no interest for that. So this is the reason. Margojata Voch has another question regarding the budget and spendings for the so-called administrative fees. The previous strategy received quite negative notes. It was approached that EU spends too much money on the organization of its action than the actions themselves. For example, the development aid. Do you think the new strategy secures any change of this tendency? Would the creation of new offices not rise the costs of administrative fees? Yes, indeed. This is a very strong criticism of how the European Union was dealing with its action in Central Asia. But at the same time, creating a development agency here in Central Asia, actually in all world where the European Union is giving development aid, would make it possible for the EU to deal better and to monitor better the spendings. Because we know here in Central Asia, one of the main criticism of how the EU money is spent, and generally how the donors' money are spent, are the corruption charges. So indeed, administrative costs are high, but at the same time, we have money not well spent because of corruption. So if the EU would be more focused on the accountability of the spending of the money, I believe that the costs wouldn't be that high. From UNHCR, a liaison office to the OSCE, you focused on EU internal strategy development. There were and are many other actors interested and engaged in the region. Next to China, just mentioned, there are also Russia, and in particular, I'm sorry, the chat is not working so well. And in particular, in the early phases following the dissolution of the USSR, Turkey. To which extent the modification of the EU approaches were reactions to approaches and levels of engagement of these other actors, and to which extent the Central Asian states are balancing the role of the competing actors. Yes, indeed. I focused more on how the European Union was developing its own strategy towards Central Asia. But indeed, it's worth mentioning that there are many actors involved in Central Asia. So we have Russia, China as the main ones. We had United States, we have Turkey, Iran, India. So, and now raising Japan and South Korea. Of course, the European Union developed its own foreign relations strategies generally based on an assessment of how the entire international system is working. So that is why in 2003, the European Union had its first security strategy in order to be better prepared to deal with the security threats at the global level. And at the same time, the 2016 global strategy is a response to the challenges from other actors such as Russia and China. So, of course, the European Union is all the time taking into account how the other actors are dealing with the specific regions, and we see that in Central Asia. The Central Asian states are trying to balance these many actors based on their interests. Central Asia is a region where the states adopted multi-vector policies, as we know, or positive neutrality, as Turkmenistan calls it. So they cherry pick what they need from different actors, leaving their doors open. They do not want to officially side only with one actor, and we witnessed that in the past almost 30 years of how the Central Asian states dealt with the military security and how it balanced Russia, the US, and China. Okay. From Octavian Roșca, another question: is there an internal unional silver lining for the fact that greater EU actors are involved with the Central Asia and other EU member states like the Eastern countries are not, even though they have a political will and in theory EU can provide and resources to do so? I believe that the European Union still has lots of things to do in order to really build a foreign policy like that we are comparing with, like that of a state. So we are still thinking of the European Union as mostly as a get-together of nation states who have their own foreign policies. And what the European Union can do and is doing mostly is offering a strategic framework which is agreed by member states, and it should do more in ensuring this unitary action and unity. And that's why I called for more involvement of the member states that seem to not have resources like the Eastern European countries, but are willing to work with Central Asia. And the European Union should provide this, this frame of cooperation. The new strategy was criticized for being incomplete and vague in terms of specific measures on, for instance, how to reach progress in terms of human rights protection in the region. Could you address the main concerns? Yes, indeed, the previous strategy was also criticized. And generally, the European Union and the United States are criticized for not really taking action against how the human rights issues are dealt with in Central Asia. The problem is that when you are an actor as the European Union, you are bound also by the member states. The member states have their own interests here, as I repeatedly mentioned. So the human rights agenda is a normative agenda of the European Union, but at some point it is trumped by the security agenda of the member states. We remember all the 2005 anti-John incidents in Uzbekistan, when Uzbekistan was sanctioned by the European Union, but those sanctions were quite quickly dropped. And why was it so? Because Germany had interests in continuing the cooperation with Uzbekistan on security matters. So the human rights progress is really bound on the nation states. The European Union does not have any leverage. As we saw, the development aid and the trade agreements are not so significant after all, if we look in absolute terms for Central Asian states, in order for them to bother dealing more specifically with the human rights issues. How human rights is balanced with other components of the new EU strategy, how it is balanced with security and economic aspects of the cooperation. Thank you, Sadi, for a question. I think I just answered this by saying that the human rights agenda is a bit trumped sometimes by the economic and security. Of them is to include Afghanistan in EU Central Asia policies. Does the EU have a strategy or direction how to develop this trilateral cooperation, EU, Afghanistan, and Central Asia? Well, so Afghanistan started being included in this general framework for Central Asia from the 2012 review for the strategy by getting together the Central Asian states with Afghanistan. And the EU is always trying to bring together all these actors, because it sees the Central Asian security as connected to the Afghanistan security. So we notice this, and indeed in the new strategy is more coherently approached, let's say. But at the same time, we still have to see how this will be done in the implementation instruments. How will the European Union will deal with the budgetary allocations, with how the priorities are implemented on the ground with Central Asia and Afghanistan. Could you tell more about the rule of law initiative as one of the EU's main priority in Central Asia in general and in Kyrgyzstan particularly? Yes, the rule of law initiative is a very interesting initiative, is a very normative initiative, but with quite limited success. It deals with human rights and reform of the justice system, and the rule of law is one of the priority areas in this normative agenda of the European Union, and it was funded in this sense in the region. But at the same time, the success, as we saw even in the self-evaluation of the European Union, is limited. And in this sense, and the very good analysis on this particular area is the book that I mentioned by Olga Linda Spicer. She has an entire chapter dedicated to the rule of law initiative here in Central Asia and how it didn't really reach its intended goal of promoting real reforms on the ground. I think there are no more questions. No.
I think that was the last question, right?
Yes. Yes.
So now I guess we can close our lecture.
Thank you very much,
Ana-Maria, for your time and for this interesting lecture. We will state against the book we mentioned. Okay, there's another question.
Yes. Olga Linda Spicer, The EU Influence in Central Asia, is a book from 2018 published by Lexington Books.